Choi Jin-Hyuk wasn't a man you looked at twice if you valued your life. He was a shadow given form, a storm in a tailored black suit that held the city of Seoul in a chokehold. They called him the Ghost King, a man who moved in silence and left only wreckage in his wake. Tattoos of ancient, violent stories peeked from his collar, but they were nothing compared to the coldness in his eyes. But Jin-Hyuk's greatest defeat wasn't a lost turf war or a police raid. It was the 4-year-old girl in the soft white dress who sat across from him, clutching the silence like a shield. Mina hadn't made a sound in over 1,000 days, not since the night the sky turned orange and her mother's screams were swallowed by the roar of a house fire. To the world, she was the mafia's silent princess. To Jin-Hyuk, her silence was a ticking clock, a daily reminder that for all his power, he couldn't save his own blood from the dark. The library wasn't a room. It was a tomb of knowledge and cold power. Zora Vance stood at the edge of the firelight, her hands white-knuckled around a bottle of vintage wine. She was a ghost in a black uniform and a lace headband, a woman whose only goal was to be invisible, collect her check, and keep her father's heart beating in a hospital bed across town. "Don't look at his eyes," the head butler had hissed at her in the hallway. "Don't speak unless he commands it. To him, you are furniture. Stay that way." Zora took a breath, adjusted her crisp white apron, and stepped into the lion's den. The air in the library smelled of expensive bourbon, old paper, and the sharp, metallic tang of fear. As Zora leaned over the table, her posture tense and defensive, she reached to fill Jin-Hyuk's glass. She didn't mean for it to happen, but as she moved, the scent of her lotion, vanilla and cheap drugstore lavender, wafted toward the child. Jin-Hyuk went rigid, his eyes, predatory and calculating, snapped up to Zora's face with a focus that could stop a heart. But before he could utter a threat, the silence of the library was shattered, not by him. Mina's small arms reached out, not with the playfulness of a child, but with the desperation of a drowning soul. Her tiny lips parted, and a voice that had been buried for years finally broke through the quiet. "Mama." The wine bottle slipped, crashing against the mahogany table. Zora froze, her mouth open in a silent gasp, caught in the center of a storm she didn't understand. Jin-Hyuk surged to his feet, his hand instinctively hovering near the weapon beneath his jacket, his unreadable face finally cracking into a mask of lethal shock. "Welcome to the new dynasty. You just witnessed a miracle that's about to become a massacre. If you thought you knew what a mother's love looks like or how far a monster will go to protect his own, you're not ready for what's coming. Hit that like button if your heart just stopped. Subscribe because the Ghost King has just found his queen and he's never letting her go. Let's see how one word from a child's mouth burns the underworld to the ground." The wine bottle slipped from Zora's fingers, crashing onto the mahogany table and staining the white linen like a fresh wound. She didn't move to clean it. She couldn't. Her breath was trapped in her throat, her eyes locked on the small girl whose arms were still outstretched, trembling with an urgency that felt like a physical pull. "Mama!" Mina cried again, the word vibrating through the heavy silence of the library. It was a sound that shouldn't have existed, a miracle wrapped in a haunting mystery. The air in the room shifted instantly. Choi Jin-Hyuk didn't just stand, he surged, the sheer force of his presence causing the firelight to flicker. In a heartbeat, the heavy oak doors at the back of the library swung open. 3 men in dark suits appeared from the shadows, wraiths of the Ghost King, their hands moving with practiced lethal intent toward the holsters beneath their jackets. "Don't move," a voice hissed near Zora's ear. Before she could blink, the defensive gesture she'd held mid-air was forced down. A guard's hand clamped onto her shoulder, pinning her against the edge of the table. The smell of expensive bourbon was replaced by the cold, metallic scent of gun oil. Jin-Hyuk didn't look at his men. He didn't even look at the child who was now sobbing, her face buried in the velvet rabbit, as if the effort of speaking had drained her soul. His narrow, predatory eyes were fixed entirely on Zora. He stepped out of the shadows, the tattoos on his neck seeming to writhe in the dancing firelight. He looked like vengeance carved from stone, his face a mask of brutal, calculating elegance. "Who are you?" he whispered. The voice wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of a death sentence. I'm just the maid, sir," Zora gasped, her voice thin and fractured. Her lace headband had slipped, and her wide eyes searched his for a mercy she knew didn't exist in this house. "I was just pouring the wine. I don't know why she—" Jin-Hyuk reached out, his gloved hand tilting her chin up with terrifying precision. He studied her face as if he could peel back her skin to find the lie beneath. "My daughter has been a ghost for 1,000 days. She hasn't whispered a prayer, let alone a name, and yet she sees a servant she has never met, and she finds her voice?" He leaned in closer, his breath cold against her cheek. "Nobody stumbles into my world by accident, Zora Vance. Tell me the truth before I let my men find it for me. How did you bewitch her? What poison did you put in her head to make her call a stranger mother?" Zora looked past him at the sobbing child, and for a second, the fear of the guns vanished. A phantom ache, a grief she had carried since a cold clinic room 2 years ago, flared in her chest. She wasn't standing in a library anymore. She was standing on the edge of a truth that was about to set her world on fire. The cold library dissolved into the sterile, unforgiving white of a memory Zora had tried to bury under a mountain of hospital bills and double shifts. 2 years ago, the air hadn't smelled of bourbon and old books, but of industrial bleach and the sharp metallic tang of an underground clinic. She remembered the weight of the contract in her hands, the paper trembling just as the wine bottle had tonight. $10,000. It was the price of her father's surgery, the cost of his life exchanged for 9 months of her own. She had been a vessel, a ghost carrying a secret for a faceless elite couple, told never to look back, never to wonder. "Just breathe, Miss Vance," the doctor had said. His voice had been as clinical as the steel tray beside him. She remembered the agonizing hours of labor in that windowless room, the way she had braced herself to hear a cry, the only sound that would make the sacrifice feel real. But when the moment came, there was only a devastating, hollow silence. "I'm sorry," the doctor had muttered, his eyes refusing to meet hers as he checked a clipboard. "Complications. The infant didn't make it. It's better this way. No attachments." Zora had woken up hours later, sedated and shattered, her womb screaming with a phantom ache that no amount of money could soothe. They had handed her a check and a discharge paper, ushering her out into the rain before she could even ask where the small, still body had been taken. She had mourned a shadow for 700 days, convinced she was a mother to a ghost. The memory snapped like a dry twig as Choi Jin-Hyuk's fingers tightened on her chin, dragging her back to the present. The fire in the library hissed, casting long, dancing shadows across his tattooed skin. "You're shaking," Jin-Hyuk observed, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He searched her eyes, finding not the guilt of a spy, but a raw, bleeding recognition that mirrored the longing in his daughter's face. "You look like you've seen a dead woman walking." Zora's gaze drifted past the monster in the Armani suit to the little girl in the white dress. Mina was still reaching, her small fingers curling in the air as if trying to catch a fading dream. The curve of the child's jaw, the specific, heartbreaking depth of her brown eyes, they weren't just familiar, they were the features Zora had spent 2 years imagining in the dark. The truth began to claw its way up her throat, terrifying and impossible. The clinic hadn't been a place of tragedy, it had been a crime scene, and the child she thought was buried in a nameless grave was currently calling her Mama in the heart of a mafia fortress. The silence of the library was no longer empty, it was pressurized, heavy with the weight of a secret screaming to be heard. Jin-Hyuk could not release Zora. Instead, he signaled to the man at his right, his most trusted lieutenant, Sang-woo. There was no need for words. A black medical kit was produced, and the glint of a sterile needle caught the firelight. Zora felt the sharp sting in her arm before she could protest, her blood blooming into a small glass vial. Across from her, a cotton swab was brushed against the inside of Mina's cheek. The air seemed to vanish from the room as they waited. Jin-Hyuk had installed a rapid sequencing lab in the basement years ago, a tool for a man who trusted nothing he couldn't verify with science. 30 minutes passed in a haunting stillness. Mina had fallen into a fitful sleep in the corner of the leather sofa, her small hand still gripping Zora's discarded lace headband. Jin-Hyuk stood by the window, a silhouette of jagged edges against the moonlight, his reflection a mask of iron. When the tablet finally chimed, the sound was like a gunshot. Sang-woo approached his boss, his own face uncharacteristically pale. He handed over the device. Jin-Hyuk's eyes scanned the data, the illuminated screen casting a ghoulish blue light over his tattoos. 99.9%. Biological parentage confirmed. The tablet shattered against the marble floor as Jin-Hyuk's composure finally detonated. He turned, his chest heaving, his eyes burning with a terrifying, fractured light. He didn't look at Zora as a threat anymore. He looked at her as a woman who had been resurrected from a grave he didn't know existed. 4 years, he whispered, the words sounding like breaking glass. 4 years I was told my wife had finally conceived. 4 years I was told the fire was an accident that took her life and left my daughter broken. He stepped toward Zora, his shadow swallowing her whole. The realization was a tidal wave. His infertile wife, desperate for an heir to please the syndicate, had orchestrated the surrogacy in secret. But his own men, the men who swore to bleed for him, had been the ones to fake the child's death, hand-picking a surrogate they thought they could discard like trash once the pure heir was secured. They lied. Jin-Hyuk roared, the sound vibrating the bookshelves. My underboss, the clinic, the doctors, they didn't just steal a child, they stole a mother. He looked at Zora's trembling hands, then at Mina's peaceful face. The Ghost King of Seoul realized that his entire empire was built on a foundation of betrayal. Every hand he had shaken in the last 4 years belonged to a man who had helped kidnap his daughter from the woman standing before him. The hunt was no longer for a spy. It was for the heads of everyone who had kept his family apart. The wreckage of the tablet lay between them, a jagged mirror reflecting the ruins of the life Jin-Hyuk thought he knew. He stood over the shards, his breathing heavy, the predatory stillness of the Ghost King replaced by a frantic, white-hot rage. Zora remained pinned against the table, her mind reeling from the scientific proof that her daughter, her heartbeat, her deceased baby, was sleeping just feet away. "You can't let them know," Jin-Hyuk whispered, his voice vibrating with a lethal edge. He turned to face her, his eyes scanning the library as if the very walls had ears. The Shadow Council, they orchestrated this to control the succession. If they find out the surrogate survived, if they find out you are here, they won't just kill you, they will erase Mina to hide the evidence of their betrayal. Zora's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. "I have to take her. I have to go," she gasped, her maternal instinct finally overriding her terror. "She's mine. You heard the test." "You wouldn't make it to the end of the driveway," Jin-Hyuk cut her off, stepping into her space until the scent of cedar and danger overwhelmed her. "My underboss has eyes in every corner of this city. To them, you are a loose end. To me, you are the only person who can keep my daughter's voice alive. But in this world, I cannot protect a maid." He reached into his desk, pulling out a heavy, cream-colored document. It wasn't a death warrant, but to Zora, it looked just as daunting. "There is only one way to grant you the immunity of the Choi name. There is only one way to make you untouchable by the council." He slapped the document onto the mahogany table, right over the wine-stained linen. It was a marriage license, pre-signed by his legal team, leaving the space for the bride's name hauntingly blank. "A contract of blood," he declared, his gaze locking onto hers with a possessive intensity. You will marry me. You will trade that maid's uniform for the crown of the Ghost Queen. You will live in this house, you will sleep behind my steel doors, and you will be Mina's mother in the eyes of the law and the underworld. Zora looked at the pen he held out. It felt heavier than the wine bottle. And if I refuse? Jin-Hyuk's expression didn't soften, but a flicker of raw desperation crossed his features. Then we both lose her. Sign it, Zora. Become a monster's wife or watch them take our daughter again. This isn't a proposal, it's a survival mandate. Zora looked at Mina, then at the man the world feared. With a hand that finally stopped shaking, she took the pen. The maid was gone. The queen was being forged in the firelight. The transition from the servants' quarters to the primary suite of the Choi penthouse was a journey across worlds, though to Zora, it felt like moving from one cage to a much more expensive one. The walls were almost entirely glass, offering a panoramic view of Seoul that shimmered like a sea of diamonds, yet the air inside remained cold, sterile, and thick with the silence of a museum. In this palace of steel and light, Zora was no longer required to carry a wine bottle or wear a lace headband, but the silk gowns Jin-Hyuk provided felt like armor she hadn't earned. She moved through the vast, open spaces with a ghost's grace, her eyes always seeking out the small girl in white. For Mina, however, the change was instantaneous. The child who had spent years retreating into the shadows now bloomed like a flower in the sun. Under Zora's care, the silent princess began to hum. She played with her velvet rabbit near Zora's feet, her dark eyes tracking her mother's every move with a fierce, quiet devotion. But as Mina thrived, the friction between her parents sparked like flint. She needs to go to the park, Zora said one evening, standing in the center of the living room. Her voice, once a whisper in the kitchen, was finding its edge. She needs grass beneath her feet and the sound of other children, not these glass walls and men with earpieces. Jin-Hyuk stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his reflection ghosting over the city he ruled. He didn't turn around. The world outside those walls is a shooting gallery, Zora. Every playground is a tactical nightmare. Here, she is safe. Here, I can control the variables. You're not controlling variables, you're suffocating a soul, Zora countered, stepping toward him. You live in a world of threats and power plays, but she lives in a world of touch and sound. She didn't speak for 1,000 days because there was nothing in this house worth speaking to. Jin-Hyuk turned then, his eyes narrowed, the tattoos on his neck dark against his white silk shirt. He walked toward her, his presence an overwhelming wave of quiet menace. I have spent 4 years building a fortress to keep the monsters out. Do not tell me how to protect my daughter. She's my daughter, too, Zora snapped, her heart hammering but her gaze refusing to drop. And I would rather she be a child in a storm than a statue in a tomb. The air between them vibrated with a sudden, dangerous heat. It wasn't just the clash of their worlds, the maid from the streets and the king from the shadows, but a raw, burgeoning recognition of the fire they both carried for the same child. For a moment, the Ghost King looked at his contract wife and saw something more than a loose end. He saw the only person in the world brave enough to tell him he was wrong. In the glass-walled silence, the battle lines were drawn. But for the first time, Jin-Hyuk wasn't sure if he wanted to win. The fragile peace of the penthouse was shattered not by a scream, but by a rhythmic electronic hum that shouldn't have been there. It was late, the kind of hour where the city lights outside the glass walls felt like distant, cold stars. Zora was tucking the silk duvet around Mina's shoulders, her fingers lingering on the child's soft curls, when she heard it. It was a faint, high-pitched frequency emanating from the base of the hand-carved rocking horse in the corner, a gift from Jin-Hyuk's underboss, sang he, to celebrate the miraculous recovery of the silent princess. Zora knelt, her breath catching as she ran her hand along the polished wood. Her fingers snagged on a tiny, metallic protrusion no larger than a grain of rice. A cold dread washed over her, more freezing than the wind against the glass. She wasn't just being watched, she was being recorded. Every lullaby she sang, every whispered secret about the clinic, every moment of growing tenderness between her and the Ghost King was being fed directly back to the wolves. As she held the tiny device, a memory surfaced with violent clarity. She recalled the day at the clinic, sedated and drifting, catching a glimpse of a man through the cracked door. He hadn't been a doctor. He had been wearing an expensive signet ring, a gold band etched with a weeping willow. It was the same ring she had seen on Sang-hee's hand just yesterday during the contract signing. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The loyal underboss hadn't just been a witness to the fire, he was the architect of the theft. He had stolen her baby from the clinic and placed her in Jin-Hyuk's home like a cuckoo in a nest, all to ensure he had a tether to the boss's heart. He was the one who had told her the baby died, and he was the one now listening to her breathe in the dark. Zora looked at the sleeping Mina, then at the heavy oak doors that led to Jin-Hyuk's study. The man who had forced her into a marriage of convenience was sleeping in a house full of traitors, unaware that his most trusted viper was coiled in the nursery. She didn't run, she didn't scream. With a steady hand, Zora tucked the bug into her pocket and stood up. The fear that had defined her life as a maid was being burned away by a cold, maternal fury. She was no longer just a loose end in a mafia war. She was the only one who knew where the knife was hidden, and she was about to show the Ghost King exactly how deep the betrayal ran. The penthouse was silent, save for the low hum of the city 100 floors below. Zora found Jin-Hyuk in the small gym adjacent to a study, the doors left slightly ajar. He was alone, his back to her, having discarded his dress shirt after a long night of strategy. In the harsh overhead light, the Ghost King looked less like a legend and more like a map of survival. His back was a landscape of jagged white lines, scars that carved through his intricate tattoos like lightning through a dark forest. They weren't just marks of battle, they were a history of every time he had been cornered and refused to break. Zora stepped into the room, the bug from the nursery heavy in her palm. The floorboard creaked, and in a movement too fast for the human eye, Jin-Hyuk spun around, his hand already reaching for a blade on the rack. He stopped when he saw her. His eyes, usually cold and impenetrable, flickered with a raw, startling vulnerability at being seen so exposed. He didn't reach for his shirt. He simply stood there, chest heaving, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I didn't hear you," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "I don't like being snuck up on, Zora." "I wasn't sneaking," she whispered, her voice steady despite the adrenaline. She walked toward him, ignoring the danger that radiated from his scarred frame. She didn't look away from his wounds. "I came to tell you that the Viper isn't at the gates, Jin-Hyuk. He's already in the house." She held out her hand, revealing the listening device. Jin-Hyuk's eyes locked on the metallic grain, and for a moment the air in the room turned to ice. He didn't roar, he didn't move, he simply looked at the evidence of his underboss's betrayal, then back at Zora. He saw the way she stood, shoulders squared, eyes burning with a maternal fire that mirrored his own protective rage. She wasn't the trembling maid from the library anymore. She was a woman who had survived the loss of a child and come back to claim her. "Sang-hee put this in the nursery," she said, her voice like tempered steel. "He's been watching us. He's the one who took her from me at the clinic. I saw his ring." Jin-Hyuk reached out, his fingers brushing against hers as he took the device. The touch was electric, a bridge between two broken people. He looked at her, truly seeing the iron in her spirit for the first time. "You found what my entire security detail missed," he murmured, a grim, respectful smile touching his lips. "They call me a monster, Zora, but you are the storm that even monsters should fear." In that moonlit gym, the contract marriage shifted. They were no longer a boss and a servant bound by a legal lie. They were two parents, scarred and fierce, finally standing on the same side of the war. The Ghost King had found his queen, and she was far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. The grand ballroom of the Lottie Hotel was a sea of crimson silk and sharpened knives. This was the Crimson Gala, the annual summit of the underworld's elite, where alliances were toasted in champagne and betrayals were whispered behind lace fans. Zora walked at Jin-Hyuk's side, her hand resting lightly on his arm. She was no longer the maid in the ruffled apron. She was a vision in a floor-length gown of deep emerald, her neck adorned with diamonds that felt like a cold, heavy collar. "Head up," Jin-Hyuk murmured, his voice a low vibration meant only for her. "You are the queen of the Ghost King. If you flinch, they will smell the blood." Zora tightened her grip on his arm, her eyes scanning the room. She could feel the weight of 100 predatory gazes. At the center of the room stood Sang-hee, the underboss, his gold signet ring glinting under the chandeliers as he held court. He smiled at them, a serpentine expression that didn't reach his eyes. Zora felt the hidden bug in her evening clutch, a reminder of the viper's reach. As they navigated the crowd, a man stepped out from the shadows near the bar. He was older, with a face like crumpled parchment, and eyes that darted with a frantic, nervous energy. Zora's breath hitched. She knew that posture. She knew the way he adjusted his glasses. It was Dr. Eris, the man from the clinic, the man who had told her her baby was dead. The doctor's glass shattered on the marble floor as his eyes met Zora's. For a moment, the music seemed to die. The recognition was instantaneous and mutual. He began to back away, his face turning a ghostly shade of gray. "You," he wheezed, his voice lost in the swell of the orchestra. Before Zora could react, Sang-hee was there, his hand landing on the doctor's shoulder with a grip that looked like a caress but functioned like a vice. "Dr. Eris," Sang-hee said, his voice smooth as oil. "You look as though you've seen a ghost. Perhaps you should step into the garden for some air." Zora looked at Jin-Hyuk, but he was already moving. His eyes narrowed as he spotted the flash of movement in the balconies above. The gala was no longer a party. It was a cage. Suddenly, the lights flickered and died, plunging the opulent room into a terrifying, suffocating darkness. "The nursery!" Zora gasped, her maternal instinct screaming over the panic of the crowd. "Sang-woo, go!" Jin-Hyuk roared over the rising din. But as the emergency red lights began to pulse, Zora saw that Sang-hee and the doctor were gone, and the space where Mina had been seated with her nanny was empty. The trap hadn't just been sprung, it had been built around them from the very start. The maid turned queen was now a mother in a war zone, and the gala was about to turn into a bloodbath. The hotel was a labyrinth of smoke and screaming shadows. In the pulsing red glow of the emergency lights, Jin-Hyuk didn't look like a husband. He looked like the god of war he had been born to be. He moved with a terrifying, liquid grace, clearing the service stairwell as they raced toward the rooftop helipad. "They're taking her to the old shipyard," Jin-Hyuk growled, his hand gripping a suppressed pistol. "Sang-hee has a chopper waiting. If he clears the harbor, we lose her forever." Zora didn't hesitate. She had spent weeks learning the layout of Jin-Hyuk's properties, not as a resident, but with the meticulous eye of a woman who knew every hidden door and service cross-space. "The freight elevators," she gasped, pointing toward a heavy steel door marked for staff only. "They're on a separate power grid. We can beat them to the roof." They moved as one, a collision of underworld violence and maternal desperation. When the elevator doors groaned open on the rooftop, the wind whipped Zora's emerald gown around her legs like a battle flag. Rain lashed against the concrete, blurring the line between the sky and the dark sea below. At the edge of the ledge stood Sang-hee, his golden ring catching the strobe of the approaching helicopter. He held a struggling, crying Mina over the sheer drop of the 40-story building. "One step closer, Jin-Hyuk, and the pure line ends tonight." Sang-hee's voice was lost in the roar of the rotors. Jin-Hyuk leveled his weapon, his finger tightening on the trigger. But Zora saw the truth. Sang-hee wasn't watching the boss. He was watching the weak Maid. She saw the way his weight was distributed, the way the doctor stood trembling behind him with a medical case that likely held the sedative intended for her daughter. "You think I'm the loose end?" Zora screamed over the wind, stepping away from Jin-Hyuk's side. She didn't look at the gun or the traitor. She looked directly into Mina's terrified eyes. "I am the woman who carried her through the dark. I am the mother who survived your clinic and your fire." In a coordinated strike they hadn't even rehearsed, Jin-Hyuk fired a distracting shot into the helicopter spotlight, blinding the pilot. In that split second of whiteout, Zora didn't run, she lunged. She threw herself onto the wet concrete, sliding beneath Sang-hee's guard and snatching Mina's waist just as Sang-hee lost his footing. The impact sent Sang-hee staggering back toward the ledge. Jin-Hyuk was there in an instant, his hand around the traitor's throat, pinning him over the abyss. But Zora didn't watch the monster fall. She was curled on the cold stone, shielding Mina with her own body, the diamonds at her neck sparkling with rain and tears. For the first time, the Ghost King didn't look at his enemy. He looked at his wife, who had just performed a feat of courage he couldn't have scripted. The blood was on the floor, but the fire was finally out. The storm that had nearly dismantled the Choi Empire finally broke, leaving the morning sky over Seoul a bruised, peaceful lavender. Inside the penthouse, the glass walls no longer felt like a cage, but a lens through which a new era was beginning. The scent of ozone and rain had been replaced by the warm, grounding aroma of breakfast and the soft, steady sound of Mina's laughter, a sound that was no longer a miracle, but a daily promise. Choi Jin-Hyuk stood by the fireplace, the morning light catching the sharp lines of his face. He was dressed not in the armored layers of a mob boss, but in a simple black sweater, his tattooed hands steady as he watched Zora. She sat on the velvet sofa, Mina nestled in her lap, the two of them looking like a portrait of a piece bought at a terrible price. There was no longer a need for the emerald gowns of the gala or the black uniform of the library. Zora wore a soft silk robe, but the way she carried herself was more regal than any queen. She had moved through the fire and the blood, and she had come out forged in iron. The maid who had once flinched at the sound of opening doors was gone. In her place was the woman who had stared down a traitor on a 40-story ledge and won. Jin-Hyuk approached them, his movements devoid of their usual predatory tension. He knelt before Zora, placing a hand on Mina's knee before reaching out to cover Zora's hand with his own. The silence between them was no longer the heavy, suffocating quiet of a museum. It was the comfortable, shared breath of two survivors. "The council is gone," Jin-Hyuk murmured, his voice a low, gravelly vow. "The traitors have been purged, and the records of the clinic have been burned. There are no more lies between us, Zora, no more contracts." He reached into his pocket and produced a ring, not the cold gold of a syndicate signet, but a simple, brilliant band of platinum. "You were brought here as a servant, and you stayed as a protector. Now stay because you are the heart of this house, not by blood, not by law, but by choice." Zora looked at the man the world called a monster, and she saw the father who had been willing to burn the city down for their child. She leaned forward, pressing her forehead against his, a gesture of absolute equality. "I'm not going anywhere," she whispered. Mina looked up from her velvet rabbit, her brown eyes bright and knowing. She reached out, small hands pulling both of them closer until they were a single, unbroken circle. The Ghost King had his queen, the mother had her daughter, and for the first time in 4 years, the Choi dynasty wasn't built on fear, but on a love that had survived the dark. The family was finally whole. That's how a maid became an empress, how a Ghost King learned what it means to be human, and how a family was forged in the wreckage of a lie and the fire of a mother's love. If Zora's transformation from a trembling servant to a lethal queen gripped you by the soul, and if you felt the weight of every silent year Mina spent waiting for her mama, then you know what the assignment is. Smash that like button to honor a love that fights back. Hit subscribe and join the inner circle because we're just beginning to tell the stories that will break your heart and put it back together again. Now, talk to me in the comments. Which moment left you completely breathless? Was it the library trap, the revelation of the clinic's betrayal, or the way Zora moved through fire to claim her daughter? I'm sitting here absolutely floored by this journey, and I need to know you're right there with me. Until our next descent into the dark and the beautiful, remember, the most powerful families aren't always born. Sometimes they're seized. Now go forth and be absolutely feral about this story. I'll see you in the next tale.